The 2nd of December 2001, Phoenix Police Department receive a 911 call from a man who has just discovered the body of his estranged wife in her apartment.
The radio call came out. I went to the scene.
The victim, 32-year-old Dawn Tucker Subia, is lying dead on her bed with a single gunshot wound to the back of her head.
She has several strands of short, curly black hair in her hand. She has injuries to her thighs, and it looked like her necklace had been ripped off.
Police immediately launch a murder investigation, which quickly reveals the complicated personal life of the victim. The investigation uncovers a history of abusive and controlling behavior by an ex-boyfriend towards the victim.
He would break in the door, throw things at her. He would put her in the hospital, break her jaw, had broken her nose numerous times.
Investigators identify a prime suspect in the case, but can they gather enough evidence to bring the perpetrator of this horrific crime to justice? Phoenix in Arizona is one of the fastest growing cities in the United States.
Phoenix is located about 180 miles north of the Mexico border. It's the 5th most populated city in the United States, with about 5 million people living in the Phoenix metropolitan area.
Phoenix has grown a lot since the 90s. There's a lot of property crimes, violent crimes, and homicides.
On the evening of the 2nd of December 2001, following a 911 call, officers from the Phoenix Police Department discover a woman's body in the bedroom of an apartment in the Ahwatukee foothills area of the city.
Ahwatukee foothills is about 12 miles from downtown Phoenix. It's really a nice area near a country club, a nice lake, golf courses, good schools.
Certain areas have a higher volume of crime than others. This wasn't completely untouched, but it was a pretty quiet area.
The 911 caller, 37-year-old Kenneth Subia, waits outside the apartment.
Kenneth basically calls the police department and says, hey, my estranged wife, I came to her apartment and she's dead and she's laying on her bed.
The victim in the apartment is Subia's estranged wife, 32-year-old mother of 3, Dawn Tucker Subia.
I was a brand new officer. I had been out of the academy about 6 months. I had been through my field training and finished that a few months before this incident occurred. The bedroom was kind of towards the back of the apartment. There was some blood around her head, to what I recall seeing.
Officers questioned Dawn's estranged husband, Kenneth Subia, at the scene to find out more about her movements in the days leading up to her death.
I was initially directed to speak to Kenneth Subia, the estranged husband of the victim. Kenneth had told me that he and Dawn were still married at the time. They had 2 children together.
Dawn Subia had one very important appointment, and she missed it. And that was to pick up her children, her 2 daughters, ages 4 and 5 at the time, from her estranged husband, Kenneth Subia, who had had his weekend visitation. At the end of that, she would take the kids back. But she wasn't there for that. And so the husband was alarmed by it, because that was not normal at all. So he decided to go to the apartment and find out what was going on.
He had come by to drop off the children, and she didn't answer, so he let himself into the apartment to go check on her, and he went to the bedroom and saw her laying on the bed, and he knew something wasn't right. He kind of pushed his daughters back to friends that he had with him near the doorway, and ultimately he called 911.
When detectives arrive at the scene, they walk in and see a female victim who's in her bed with a gunshot wound to the head. And immediately they start to look for a weapon. There's no gun at the scene. There's no shell casings on the floor.
The absence of a firearm or bullet casing at the scene lead police to quickly rule out suicide.
If you're committing suicide, shooting yourself in the head, the gun may still be in your hand or may drop to the floor, but it doesn't magically disappear. The absence of a gun means that there was somebody there who took it away.
Dawn's death is classified as a homicide. A murder investigation is launched and scene evidence is gathered and preserved.
After the initial responding officers, like myself, cordoned off the crime scene, identified witnesses, kept them separated so they could later be interviewed, the homicide unit would get called out and the response unit would get called out to the scene. They would author a search warrant to search and process the crime scene. They would assign a case agent to do all the primary interviews and a scene agent and another detective to assist. And the scene would work with crime scene specialists to photograph the scene, document it, and collect all the evidence.
Dawn, the victim, lived in a one-bedroom apartment. It was sparsely furnished. She was in the bedroom. Pillows were neatly arranged on the bed. She was laying pretty much across the bed, face up. She had been shot in the back of the head. There was a pool of blood underneath her head. No items looked like they were ransacked. There was no forced entry.
The original evidence that was collected at the crime scene were different items collected from her residence and from her person.
They were looking at the directionality of the weapon when it was fired. So they took samples of the blood, and then they were looking at her clothing. She had a number of hairs in her left hand, and that was an item of interest. There also was some what we call blood spatter.
They found blood on a bedroom dresser splattered on the wall. It appeared that her necklace had been ripped from her neck. There was blood on her pants. But there was no gun or no bullet casing there, even though it appeared she had been shot with a single gunshot wound into the head.
In addition, many items were collected during her autopsy, which is pretty standard when there's a deceased female involved in a case. The medical examiner collects certain types of evidence to be analyzed by the crime lab.
Kenneth Subia now informs police about Dawn's romantic involvement with an abusive and controlling ex-boyfriend who had been violent towards her in the past.
He kind of spoke a little bit more with me about how she had an ex-boyfriend named Adrian that was abusive and that she was kind of fearful of, and that he had actually spoken with the night prior because Adrian had wanted to talk to him about some custody issues, and then Dawn was kind of fearful something would happen to Kenneth or what happened to her.
Investigators now want to speak to Dawn's ex-boyfriend, Adrian Harvey. Could he provide them with more information about the events leading up to Dawn's death? December 2001. The body of 32-year-old Dawn Tucker Subia is discovered by her estranged husband, Kenneth Subia, at her one-bedroom apartment in the Ahwatukee foothills area of the city. Dawn had been in an on-off relationship with ex-boyfriend Adrian Harvey for nearly 2 years prior to her murder.
Harvey was Subia's ex-boyfriend. We knew that they had dated in the past, and investigators knew that they had had a volatile relationship, but they didn't quite know the nature of their relationship currently when this happened.
He was very jealous. She had lived with multiple female roommates, and they described actions where he would break in the door and basically throw things at her, and he would often drive by her apartment to the point where she said, "I think Adrian's going to kill me."
Adrian Harvey was 30 years old in 2001. Already, though, he had a reputation as being hot-tempered, controlling. When he didn't get his way, he could turned to threats and, in fact, even to violence.
It sounded from Kenneth's perspective of Dawn's relationship with Adrian that definitely it was not a good relationship for her and that she was very fearful of him.
The reality is when emotions come into play, that can really heighten situations, and a lot of times typically that dynamic is between a boyfriend and a girlfriend or a partnership.
Any investigator or journalist will tell you that when a young mother is found dead in her bedroom in a violent fashion, the very first person of interest, not necessarily suspect, but person of interest, would be the husband, especially an estranged husband, as was Kenneth Subia. He was the person who discovered her dead. Another thing that raises flags with detectives.
Kenneth kind of does some weird things. He covers the telephone saying he doesn't want to mess up the prints, which is, on one hand, is like a CSI move. On another hand, it could be a little bit push him towards being a suspect.
I don't know that I felt he was innocent or guilty, but I don't know that I trusted every word he said. I felt like maybe there was probably something more to his story, but if he killed her, why would he come back here with the kids? If he wanted to make sure her body was found kind of thing, there are definitely other ways to do it than to walk in with small children. So, that kind of leaned towards his innocence in my mind.
His alibi was he was with a bunch of people at his apartment, which was nearby the crime scene, with his 2 daughters asleep. There was a little bit of doubt as to whether or not he could have snuck out and done the crime. But there were multiple people that said he was there, his friends that corroborated his story.
Police locate ex-boyfriend Adrian Harvey and take him in for questioning.
He had picked her up around 10 o'clock at night. They went to a local bar called Cactus Jack's, which the police verified. They played pool till about 2 or so in the morning. Then they went to another location in downtown Phoenix, and then he dropped her off.
Investigators established that Adrian Harvey was probably the last person to see Dawn alive.
He said there was no sexual activity. I didn't kill her. When police started to really push him, though, on the number of times that he had abused the victim, he became upset. They offered him a polygraph, and then he said, "I want an attorney."
The challenge they faced immediately was that they knew he was an ex of hers, and so if his DNA was found in her apartment at all, that didn't necessarily mean that he committed a crime.
He was her boyfriend. He had reason to be in her apartment, so if his fingerprints or DNA were found there, they would have a reason to be there.
But suspicion still remains on Dawn's husband, Kenneth Subia, following his strange behavior around the apartment after finding Dawn's body.
Dawn Subia was married to her husband, Kenneth Subia, but they were estranged and separated. Kenneth Subia was actually the person that called 911 because he was watching their 4- and 5-year-old daughters at the time, and when Dawn should have been there to pick them up from their weekend visit, she didn't show up, and that's when he became extremely concerned. So he went to her Ahwatukee apartment to see what was going on, and when he went inside, that's when he found Dawn.
When detectives arrived on the crime scene, looking in the bedroom of Dawn Subia, they found blood splatter on bedroom dresser, on the walls. In her hand, they found a few strands of black curly hair, blood on her pants, apparently a necklace ripped from her neck. But what they didn't find, it's really interesting, is they didn't find a gun, even though it appeared that she had been shot in the head.
The investigation now focuses in on Adrian Harvey and the time he spent with Dawn on the night before she died.
Adrian and Dawn had been dating on and off again. Apparently they were on again for that Saturday night as they went bar hopping to a club and a bar.
There were a couple neighbors that again saw an African-American male matching the suspect Adrian's description around that apartment earlier in the evening, and there was a group of They thought, hey, there was a party going on there earlier, which would have been Kenneth and his crew when they came over to get the kids.
Witnesses see Dawn with Harvey at a well-known bar in the city later that night.
The waitress said, yeah, I saw her at the bar with Adrian and another African-American gentleman. She was happy at first, and then about after midnight, she was crying and seemed upset.
When they question Adrian Harvey about Dawn's death, he tells them that, yes, they had been together that night before. They had been at a bar in a club and had gone out that night, but he reported that he dropped Dawn off, he watched her walk into her apartment, and then he left.
The next morning, he said he tried calling her to make sure everything was fine with her, but she didn't answer the phone.
The big hole was nobody could account for his activity between 3 o'clock when he dropped her off and 7 o'clock when his other girlfriend said that she woke up and saw him in bed. So there was about a 4-hour window there of time.
But forensic evidence gathered at the crime scene and from Harvey's home could still lead to a breakthrough in the case.
There were multiple search warrants that were conducted in this case. Items of clothing and shoes were collected during the search warrant of the suspects' residences that the police were originally looking for.
The evidence collected is sent for further analysis at the Phoenix Police Department Crime Laboratory.
We started analyzing and processing evidence in this case probably within the first week that the crime happened. We would screen items for biological material, blood, semen, and saliva, and take portions or cuttings from those items that could then be forwarded for the actual DNA analysis. The original analyst found blood on a couple of different jackets and also blood on a pair of shoes.
Investigators believe the bloodstains on Harvey's coat will finally provide them with the evidence they need to charge him with Dawn's murder.
The focus at that time was actually on the blood from the suspect's jackets and his shoes. And the DNA results for those items actually came back to 2 different unidentified or unknown male profiles and not the victim.
Investigators grow increasingly frustrated as they are unable to build a solid case against their chief suspect, Adrian Harvey.
There was a lot of physical evidence of murder in the bedroom at the crime scene, but what there wasn't a gun. There wasn't a bullet casing. Physical evidence that detectives need.
Despite the best efforts of investigators, the case begins to go cold.
The original detectives did a great job of working this case, and they served multiple search warrants to places where they thought the suspect had been or was possibly keeping key items of evidence.
Nothing came back to the victim from those items collected during the search warrant of the suspect's belongings, and so they weren't significant.
At that point, they've looked at the evidence, they've exhausted all leads, and they just don't have enough to make an arrest, even though Adrian Harvey was a person of interest in Dawn's death, and that's when the case went cold.
A lot of time and effort were poured into this case, but it went cold in 2006 or thereafter.
Years pass without justice for Dawn's family and friends.
I think it's very important to keep families in the loop to know that we haven't forgotten about cases, that this case is still assigned to someone, that this person reviews it to see if there's anything new that can be done with this case.
In 2014, the case is reopened by Phoenix Police Department's cold case team.
There was a big push in general from the Phoenix Police Department to take a new look at some of these cold cases. The technology had really caught up to be able to apply it to some of the evidence they may not have been able to before, and they also were for the first time looking at using genetic genealogy.
I reviewed this case back in 2012, And I noted that it was a good case, but it had some barriers to overcome if we were ever going to solve it.
The cold case investigators did what's called cold case solvability checklist. In particular, they looked at cases where we either had a profile from the case that just hadn't hit, or there was evidence that had never been tested that was extremely useful to the case.
They also were working with the Maricopa County Attorney's Office on this as well. So you had these two powerhouse law enforcement agencies and officials that were working together in tandem on trying to solve some of these cold cases from decades before.
Could this new investigation finally bring Dawn's killer to justice and provide closure for her family? Phoenix Police Department have reopened the case for the murder of Dawn Tucker Subia. Dawn's body was discovered in her apartment by her estranged husband, Kenneth Subia, in December 2001. Dawn's ex-boyfriend, Adrian Harvey, quickly became the chief suspect in the police investigation. But a lack of conclusive evidence against Harvey prevented police from pursuing charges against him at that time for any involvement in the murder.
There were concerns about his alibi, but they didn't have any specific evidence that he actually killed Dawn. The weapon was gone. They didn't retrieve that. There was no forced entry, and it was assumed that his DNA would be found in her apartment, especially if they were hanging out that night. So they just didn't have enough to be able to charge him with her murder at that time.
The team re-examined the evidence collected by the original investigators in 2001.
Cold case would take on cases where detectives had left the unit and the cases were unsolved. They would go through with a fine-tooth comb and see what was done originally. Is there new science that will solve a case that maybe didn't exist back whenever this crime occurred? Are there people that we now know who they are or where they are that we could interview that could solve a crime?
We basically just took a look at what else has not been tested for DNA, and is there anything else that we can push towards what circumstantial evidence with the prosecution to determine, hey, this person definitely did it.
One of the most important things for any crime scene is the initial collection and preservation of evidence. With the technology changes, you never know when you might be able to go back and reanalyze an item of evidence to obtain additional information about the sample. Although we started analyzing evidence right away, it was more than a decade later that we also analyzed additional evidence that had been collected.
So there were a couple items of clothing where he was staying that night that had not been tested. We were looking for blood. And then there was fingernail clippings to see if the victim had struggled with the person who killed her. And then also they had found semen on her pants, which she was wearing when she was murdered. We wanted to know who that belonged to.
The cold case team take a closer look at Adrian Harvey and the life he has been living since 2001.
Adrian Harvey was no stranger to criminal activity. He was known to have been in other domestic abusive relationships and to be the perpetrator in those situations. So there were multiple women that had reported that Adrian Harvey was also physically and verbally abusive with them. So it was a very clear pattern that he had established.
One violent incident from 2011, a decade after the murder of Dawn Tucker Subia, particularly highlights Harvey's uncontrollable temper and rage.
He had a road rage incident in 2011 that put somebody else in the hospital. His anger continued.
That was Adrian Harvey. If he doesn't get what he wants, if he doesn't get his way, that's his strategy. Using violence, threats of violence, even death threats, to control you.
The results of the new DNA testing on the original police evidence come back from the laboratory.
Case detectives gave us the suspect Adrian Harvey's buccal swab for comparison at that time. We processed the semen stain that had originally been found on the inside of the crotch of the victim's pants, and the DNA results from that particular item matched the suspect in the case, Adrian Harvey.
Some of the items collected in 2001 are now examined for the first time.
The cigarette butt that was found outside the victim's front door was processed for DNA when we obtained an additional unidentified male profile from that item. That profile was entered into the CODIS database as a forensic unknown because we did not know who it belonged to, and it appeared that it was probative to the case. Later, that profile actually did have a CODIS hit that was returned to us, and it matched the victim's ex-husband, Kenneth Subia.
New witnesses come forward with startling new evidence about Adrian Harvey on the night Dawn was murdered.
The suspect, Adrian, was dating a lot of women at the same time, and they all kind of had a similar story, that he was a woman abuser and that he had put several of them in the hospital. He had threatened them multiple times. He would take them out to the desert and put a pistol in their forehead and basically shoot them.
Adrian Harvey felt the need to talk about Dawn Subia's death with at least two girlfriends.
Adrian basically told one of his girlfriends at the time, I was the last person to see Dawn alive. I didn't tell police that because I'm in a custody dispute with another girlfriend and I didn't want a felony warrant for my arrest. But he basically told her that.
They became key witnesses because what he told those two ladies was, okay, I was there. It was a suicide. I saw her shoot herself, and I took the gun with me.
Investigators believe these new revelations demonstrate the violent behavior Adrian Harvey is capable of and provides them with enough evidence to finally charge him for the murder of Dawn Tucker Subia.
We looked at Adrian Harvey, the suspect, and said basically he's the last person to see this woman alive. His alibi's not adding up.
From the laboratory side, we provided the final DNA report, which showed that the major component from the semen fraction from the victim's pants matched Adrian Harvey. We also had the unknown profile from the cigarette butt, later was identified to Kenneth Subia, along with those other final DNA results. And once we provide that information to the detectives, we really don't know what's happening in cases that they've determined who a suspect is.
Once they have a DNA match, that's 100%. There's really nothing more foolproof than direct evidence like DNA. And that's when they're able to arrest Adrian Harvey and charge him with first-degree murder and burglary in the death of Dawn Subia.
On the 30th of June 2015, Adrian Harvey is brought into custody and charged with the murder of Dawn Tucker Subia. Phoenix, Arizona, 2014. The reopened investigation into the murder of Dawn Tucker Subia in 2001 is now in a position to formally charge their chief suspect, Adrian Harvey, with murder.
When the county attorney's office charges somebody and submits charges for first-degree murder, that's a heavy burden of proof. You must prove that it was premeditated and that planning went into this before somebody took someone's life. You have to have a lot of evidence that supports that. And so the state had quite a bit that they were going to have to try to prove to the jury to have them convict Adrian Harvey of first-degree murder in Dawn's death.
Dawn's body was discovered by her estranged husband, Kenneth Subia, after she failed to show up to collect their daughters at the end of the weekend.
He was still an estranged husband. I'm sure he was someone of interest to the case agent at that time, and I'm sure there were further interviews conducted beyond my initial interview with him.
He had a custody issue going on with the kids. He also had a weapon. He had 9mm that had been unloaded, which was never excluded as the murder weapon. So there were a lot of things that Kenneth did that didn't do himself any favors.
Dawn's ex-boyfriend, Adrian Harvey, was the chief suspect during the initial investigation, but police at the time were unable to charge him due to a lack of evidence against him.
It's a good question as to why they couldn't resolve this investigation in the weeks or at least the months after the killing. Pretty much everything that they needed to point a finger directly at Adrian Harvey could have, you would think, have been found there. There were people who could tell you that he had made violent threats, even threats of death, against Dawn Subia, that their relationship had been somewhat heated.
When you're charging somebody, you want to make sure that that case is airtight because ultimately you want a conviction in the end. And you've got to go in there with enough evidence to convince a jury that beyond a reasonable doubt, this person committed that crime.
The Phoenix Police Department cold case team focus in on Harvey's abusive behavior towards other women in his life during the intervening years since Dawn's death, and use this to build their case against him.
What wasn't known in 2001 was his behavior in the remaining years. So the detectives early in the case didn't have benefit of talking to other women who had undergone the same kind of treatment during a relationship, or who had in fact discussed with Adrian Harvey Dawn Subia's death. That was the difference in being able to put all the pieces together and get an arrest 14 years later, and not being able to do it in 2001.
In 2017, Adrian Harvey goes on trial for the first-degree murder of Dawn Tucker Subia. Harvey maintains his innocence and claims Dawn committed suicide while he was with her in the apartment.
While prosecutors were allowed to bring in Adrian Harvey's other acts, evidence that he was controlling and violent, especially toward women, the judge did not allow the defense to go very far down the road of Dawn Subia's life. The approach by the defense was to blame Dawn Subia for her death by saying it was a suicide. And in order to promote that theory, they wanted to smear her, to show evidence that she was an escort, a prostitute, and that she had worked as a stripper.
In the first trial for Adrian Harvey, the jury found him not guilty of first-degree murder, but they could not come to a decision on the lesser charges of second-degree murder and burglary.
The first trial fell apart because the prosecutors may have been overreaching by charging first-degree murder. The jury didn't buy that. In fact, the jury voted unanimously against the first-degree murder charge. That's an acquittal, but they were hung, divided, unable to reach a conclusion on the second-degree murder charge.
So this went to a second trial, but this time they were trying Adrian Harvey for second-degree murder.
First degree is much harder for a prosecutor to prove, and the jury found that the elements of first-degree murder, premeditation, those were not proven in court. And with that, first-degree murder was out of the window. The only thing he could then be charged after that was second-degree murder.
If you go for kind of swing for the fences and go for first degree, that kind of premeditated, on this kind of case, which is a very muddy domestic case, could be difficult. So I think the second degree murder was probably the more appropriate.
On the 20th of December 2017, Adrian Harvey is convicted for the second-degree murder of Dawn Tucker Zubia.
The Superior Court judge gave him 20 years in prison, finding that there was slight aggravation in the murder, which means it could be raised up a little bit higher than if it was just a straight second-degree murder charge.
I was extremely happy to see a case closed that was, that old. It was over 10 years old at the time. Her daughters were in their late teens, I believe, at that time. That had to be very satisfying to them to finally have an answer and to finally see him serve the time. And so to me, that was satisfying to see that case closed and resolved after so much time had gone by.
Knocking on a door of a loved one that after years have passed, that's kind of given up without having justice, without having answers, there is no greater, to me, feeling in law enforcement. And to me, it was what we went in and grinded it out every day for, because it's not like Hollywood where every day is a great day. There's definitely challenges within cold case. To me, it was just it made it all worth it.
Finding out that they've made an arrest in a cold case is always a really great feeling, because you're hoping that the victim's family has some answers finally. In this case, the victim had young children at the time of her death, and it's interesting to think that they would be adults, today. And I find that human aspect of knowing that a case is resolved and wondering how it affects the family, I find that part fascinating, because all of the work that we do in the laboratory is to find that answer, to resolve the case if we can, to provide those answers.
The family and friends of Dawn Tucker Zubia are left wondering, could a crime like this have been prevented?
She had a sister that was involved and wanted to know, and those two little girls, grew up without a mother. It would be devastating to not have a mother there to help you and to be with you and love you. And then Kenneth also probably felt like he was still under the radar, and a certain amount of guilt with that.
They may not ever have closure, but they can have answers. And hopefully they can use that information and move on while they still think about their loved one.
Dawn's violent murder at the hands of a dangerous and controlling partner highlights the need for more awareness around the issue of domestic violence.
Domestic violence is such a threat in today's society and more than 20 years ago. It really hasn't changed. The hardest thing is that when you have somebody who's so controlling and so manipulative over somebody, it's a power and control dynamic, and that can be really hard to escape. So Dawn likely knew that there was danger in this, but how do you escape that? Where do you turn to? And in her case, you had an estranged husband, which is probably not somebody she's confiding in about this. And then you had Adrian Harvey, who had a pattern of being able to get his way, to really grip the power over them.
It's tough to admit to your family and friends that you were wrong about somebody and that they're secretly beating you and threatening to kill you. It is embarrassing. The acknowledgement of that is that you have to reorganize your life. You might be financially dependent on somebody. They may be the one paying the rent and the bills and all of that. You may have children together. So there are a lot of financial and emotional and ego reasons to stay in there. But staying in there too long can be deadly, as we see too often.
Every relationship is different, and every domestic violence scenario is different. They have common threads that run through them, and control is a big one. It's looking for those red flags. It can start out as little things. Oh, you're going to be home by this time? Okay, now you're going to be home at this time.
The tough thing about domestic violence is it can start with verbal abuse, and that can escalate to physical abuse. And then if somebody flies off the handle, that typically can escalate to something a lot more dangerous. And that would have been a massive red flag here just in the fact that multiple women had experienced abuse at the hands of Adrienne Harvey, including Dawn herself.
It's my belief that what happened that night was when they were doing their bar hopping on that Saturday night, and he took her home. She told him, you know, you don't fit in my life. There's no place for you. We can't have a relationship. I've got 2 daughters I've got to raise. 2 young daughters. I don't want you to be around them. I don't want you in my life because of the way you are. And just that could have been enough to send Adrienne Harvey into that rage. And there was a gun around.
After 16 years, justice is finally served on Dawn Tucker Subia's killer.
Growing up when you're 4 and 5 and suddenly a mother is taken out of your life, and every year that passes there's less of a memory, and then 14, 15 years later it erupts again with a trial, and you're no longer that little child, maybe inside, but you're physically 19, 20 years old or older, and you go to the trial and you face the person accused of killing your mother, and you're thinking as you look at this person, that's the reason I didn't grow up with my mom? That guy, on a Saturday night losing his temper, not getting what he wants, and he took my mother from me. So not only did I not grow up with my mother, my kids won't have my mother as a grandmother. That is very deep pain.
The fact that police witnesses in this case were on and off again girlfriends who also described domestic abuse from Adrienne Harvey was enough to show police that this guy had a lot of jealousy issues and control issues and rage. And when you start to get anger and rage mixed with jealousy and manipulation, that's a deadly combo. And in this case, that's exactly what happened.